A faint light from the headlights filtered through the thickets of the dense forest, reflecting on the wet asphalt. In the distance, around a bend, stood an abandoned hut, ruined, with broken windows and doors, as if long forgotten. The old crumbling roof could barely hold itself in place, and the walls, covered with mold and cracks, could have told about what once was here, but their silence was frightening. Mike and his friends drove along the winding road, trying not to look at the surrounding darkness, which seemed impenetrable. They had been driving for several hours, all tired and silent, but something about the area made them nervous. The shadow of the night thickened, and the forest became more dense, eclipsing everything around. "Maybe we should stop?" Sam suggested, noticing how tense Mike looked. "No, we need to move on," he replied. "We're close." But someone sitting in the back seat noticed something strange off to the side. Somewhere between the trees, a figure was barely visible. Vague, humanoid. A strong sense of anxiety gripped the group. "Did you see that?" Amy asked in a whisper, but no one answered. They saw everything, but no one wanted to believe it. The car continued to move. And so, when it seemed that they would soon reach the highway, a hut appeared in front of them. Strange, frightening. There wasn't a soul around her. She stood like a forgotten place, waiting. "We have to stop," Mike said, and his voice was hard. "Someone is waiting for us." They parked next to the hut and got out of the car, hearing only the crackle of dry branches under their feet. Their every movement echoed in that ominous silence. Their breathing grew louder and their hands couldn't stop shaking. Mike went to the door and tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Then Sam took an old hammer out of the trunk and they started hammering it into the door. But as soon as they got inside, the smell of old age and mold came out, mixed with something even more sinister. They staggered into the room. It was dark and cold inside. The walls of the starved tree did not bode well. From the light of the flashlight, they saw old furniture covered with dust and strange stains on the floor that they could not immediately see. It doesn't look like a place to stay," Amy said softly, looking around. "We won't be here long," Mike replied. "I just need to take a little break." But the further they went, the worse it got. They walked around the room, and eventually came across a staircase leading to the basement. From time to time, strange creaks were heard, which made everyone look around, but no one dared to say anything. It was just that everyone felt the fear growing. When they went down to the basement, they saw a scene that froze everyone's blood in their veins. There were several old suitcases on the dirty floor, with pieces of clothing sticking out of them. There was a box of notes and old photographs on the floor nearby. One of them had an image of a group of people standing near that very hut, and there was someone familiar among them. One of them looked like Mike. "What the hell is this?" Sam whispered, pointing at the photo. Mike froze. He looked at the photo and felt something pulling him into this darkness. But it was no longer just a photo. There was an inscription on the back. "They're waiting." A strong blow to the heart. Friends understood that they were not alone. Someone had been here before them and had not left this place. Mike turned abruptly to return, but the door they had entered through was closed. Beyond it was a dark, impenetrable space. A wooden floorboard creaked, and when they turned around, something moved in the darkness. The darkness was coming to life, and a figure was flickering in the shadows, standing right in front of them. The hairs on the back of everyone's neck stood on end. "Don't come out. Don't run away," a voice rang out, not from this world, but so real that they felt it right in their chest. The next moment, the door slammed open and they rushed out. But as soon as they were outside, the sky darkened, and the forest seemed to come to life, filled with sounds that could not be explained. They ran through the forest, but could not find their way back. Somewhere far ahead, in the forest, the same figure reappeared. Someone who's been watching them all this time. And it was too late to realize that they were trapped. When they finally got out into the open, the figure they had once seen in a photograph appeared in front of them. But now her face was distorted, and it was theirs. Each of them saw his own face, distorted in a sinister grimace. This was what they were afraid to see. The one who lived here. Someone who was a part of this place. The last flash of light engulfed them, and the moment the forest froze again, everything became silent. They stood in the dark, not daring to move. As they ran towards the light, they felt that it had disappeared. At that moment, they heard nothing. No footsteps, no wind, only silence, which was frightening in its all-consuming power. Mike broke the silence first. He took a step to the side, but his foot bumped into something solid glass, which resounded with a thud. Something's wrong, he said, standing in a restless pose. We're trapped. There was no fear in his voice, only despair. He carefully examined the place where they had come. The forest trees, black and empty, seemed firmly frozen in the night, not moving, not breathing. What do you mean? Sam asked, stumbling over her words. She tried to be calm, but she felt her hands freeze with horror. It's just a forest. We'll get out of here. No, we're not getting out, Mike replied, turning to the group. His eyes were filled with horror when he spoke again. This cabin, this is the place. They want us to stay, so that we don't leave. Sam took a step towards the road, but her gaze fell on some strange mark carved on one of the trees. The stripes, like notches from a knife, were almost invisible, but they stood out too brightly in the dark. For a moment she wondered what that could mean. Look, Mike, let's just get out of here. We can't stay here, she said. But Mike stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the dark depths of the forest. He didn't even pay attention to her words. Look at their footprints, he whispered, pointing to the ground. Where they stood, the footprints were clearly visible in the moist soil. Strange, deep imprints that could not have been left by any of them. It was something alien, something incredibly disturbing. We're not alone, he said, now with confidence and concern in his voice. Sam caught his gaze, and her blood froze. He was right. They weren't alone. Rachel, who had been standing a little apart all this time, clenched her hands into fists, trying to find the strength not to give up. What should we do? She said, her voice trembling. We're looking for a way out, said Jason, who was holding a knife in his hands. He began to move cautiously along the trail of footprints. Run if you don't want to die, a voice croaked, and everyone froze. It sounded so loud and sharp that it seemed to come from somewhere in the very earth. At that moment, when they turned to look at Mike, they realized that he wasn't standing alone. There was another figure in the darkness next to him, a man who didn't look like one of that group. He was in dirty clothes, his face was hidden behind a dark hood, and his eyes shone like steel in the dark. Who are you? Sam asked, feeling her voice tremble with fear. The man silently pointed to the side. Go away, quickly. Otherwise, you will all be dead, like those who once came here. But they didn't have time to react. At the same moment, there was a sound from behind, the creaking of footsteps, and when they turned around, they saw a group of people standing at the edge of the forest. They were dressed in dirty, old clothes. Their faces were cut and distorted, as if they had experienced something terrible. They weren't just people. These were those who had once tried to leave this place and now returned, but not in the form in which they were once known. They came closer, and their smell was unbearable, the smell of rot, blood, and damp earth. You're all going to die if you don't leave, one of them said, his voice low but so cold it chilled to the bone. Panic gripped them all. They ran towards the road, but when they turned around, they noticed that they were back on the same path. The same forest, the same markings on the trees, everything seemed the same. They tried to run in the other direction, but the forest seemed to close around them, and at some point, when they could no longer figure out where they were, the same male voice rang out of the darkness. It's too late. Mike, Sam, Jason, and Rachel stopped and looked back. In the darkness, they saw figures standing in the shadows. There was no sympathy in their eyes. All they saw was emptiness and death. Suddenly, one of them heard the grinding of metal and felt a cold metal object at his throat. Lightning fast. They didn't even have time to scream. At that moment, they realized that the trap they hadn't noticed had snapped shut. When they fell to the ground, their legs no longer felt the way they once did. There was a musty smell in the air, and every step they took seemed to press on their chests. They all stood in the center of the forest, feeling the space around them shrink. Jason gripped the knife in his hand, his palm sliding over the cold metal as if it was the only thing left in this world to protect. "We can't just stand there," Sam said, trying not to look into the dark forest. "We have to go." But Mike stopped her with a gesture, pointing to the footprints they had left behind. They were clearly not alone. The tracks they were following were too clear and too fresh. Someone was following them, watching their every move. "These aren't just footprints," Mike said. "It's a trap. We were trapped again." "What do you mean?" Jason asked, surveying the surrounding area. "That's it. We don't know anything about what's going on," Mike replied. "All I know is they're going to make us think we got out. But it's just part of their game. All that, it's rigged." Sam pursed her lips. Her eyes were full of fear, but she didn't let herself lose control. "Okay, but what should we do?" "What is it?" she asked. "We have to go towards the city," Jason said. "It looks like this is the only road that can get us out of here." They started moving again, but now every move was much more careful. Branches crunching underfoot, every sound that seemed innocent at first glance, made them freeze, as if waiting for a blow. They all felt like something was watching them, and the shadow that hung over them was getting denser. Where is it?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. They came to a small but well-preserved building. It stood at the edge of the forest, half obscured by tall trees. There was an old metal fence next to it, as if someone was trying to hide it from prying eyes. It's like an abandoned farm," Mike said, cautiously approaching the building. "But why didn't anyone tell us there were buildings here?" They went inside. It was dark inside, but slightly illuminated by pale light from the cracks in the roof. It smelled musty and old. There were tools everywhere, old crates, and something that might have resembled work equipment. "This isn't a farm," Jason said, looking around carefully. "It looks like warehouses. For something else. For something." "It's scary," Sam whispered, looking at one of the dilapidated doors that led to the basement. "Did you see it? This is the basement." "We don't need to go down there," Mike said, but he immediately realized it was too late. They were all trapped wherever they went. "We need to figure out what's going on here," Jason said, approaching the basement door. He opened it, and the sound of old wood echoed in the silence. It was dark downstairs, and there was an unpleasant smell in the air that pressed on the nose. They went down the stairs, feeling the ground getting wet and cold under their feet. When they reached the bottom, they realized that they were in the very center of a large underground vault. There were metal boxes along the walls, so old that they were covered with rust. But that's not what caught the group's attention. They saw something that made their hearts clench. There were several people standing in the middle of the basement. They were sitting on old chairs, with expressions of despair on their faces. Their hands were chained, and their eyes were empty and glassy. "Something's wrong," Sam whispered. One of the men, noticing their presence, tried to get up, but could not. His movements were clumsy, and it was obvious that he had been held captive for a long time. He whispered something, but his words were difficult to comprehend, as if they had lost all power. They leave us. Here," the man said, his voice barely audible. Suddenly, everything around them shook. They heard the grinding of iron, and the basement doors began to close, locking them inside. Rachel clutched at Jason, her hands shaking with fear. "Are we really going to sit here too?" "What is it?" she asked, but Jason was silent. He looked at the rest of the people chained to the walls and realized that they had no other choice. Staying here meant being destroyed just like them. In the dark basement, as the doors slowly began to close, Jason had the feeling that they had become part of something much scarier than they could have imagined. Everything around them was alien and threatening. The rust-stained walls and the chains that held people together on the chairs seemed to be part of the inevitable fate they would all fall into. Rachel screamed as the metal doors slammed shut with a loud sound. Her hands tightened on Jason, and he felt her fear transfer to him. He looked at Mike and Sam. The three of them stood there, not knowing what to do next. "It looks like the doors are locked," Mike said, banging his fist on the metal. "We need to find a way out." Jason turned around and looked around the basement, his gaze sliding around the dark corners, trying to find at least some signs of a possible escape. But instead, his eyes settled on what was in the center of the room. Strange metal structures that looked like cages. There were several of them, and inside each of them were dead bodies lying in terrible poses. A strange, unnatural silence hung in the air, but there was something more in this silence, a heaviness, an unbearable heaviness that pressed on his chest. They were all here," Sam whispered, peering into one of the cages. "We won't survive." And then they heard a sound. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but it was getting louder. The grinding of metal, the rattle of chains. One of the people sitting in chains suddenly began to twitch. His body began to writhe, but the movements were abrupt and awkward, as if the person was trying to free himself, but could not. We have to go," Jason said sharply, feeling his pulse quicken. His gaze darted around the walls, and he found a small crack in the corner that could have been an exit, but the way there was blocked by a pile of old boxes. He ran up to her, trying to move one of the heavy boxes. Mike and Sam followed. They were all in a panic, but they knew they didn't have time. Every moment could be the last. He's doing something," Mike said, pointing at the man in chains, whose movements were becoming increasingly violent. Now he was screaming, but the sounds of his voice were muffled, cut off, as if someone was trying to escape from the ground. Jason tried to make way, but the door on the other side of the basement opened, and a man in dirty clothes with heavy metal gloves entered the room. He stood motionless and watched them. His gaze was icy, merciless. "Go away," he said, showing neither fear nor emotion. "Otherwise you will have to join them." Jason clenched his fists and his eyes widened with rage. "We're not going to stay here," he said, coming closer. But the man did not meet them halfway. He just stood there like a stone statue. Suddenly, the man took a step to the side. He opened the door that led to another compartment and stepped inside, but did not say a word. Everyone stood in silence, not knowing what to do next. Jason, without hesitation, rushed after him, with the others on his tail. Fear and adrenaline overwhelmed them. The new room was dark and cold, and then they noticed that the walls were covered with cracks, from which blood was oozing. It was not just a place, it was like a laboratory where someone was tortured, where someone's lives were destroyed. And at that moment, as they looked around in horror, the door slammed shut from behind. They were alone inside. No way out. The last look they exchanged said the only thing: they wouldn't be able to get out.